English.
Cool. It's recording. Thank you.
Amazing. Cool. Hi, everyone. For those who know me and those who know me less, my name is Hadar. I am currently on the CA team for Madrid UTC. I'm also the reigning WDC ESL champion. And I was requested to give you today a workshop on particularly the question of how to be comparative in debating. Or, as I like to call it, in the game of debate, you don't need to win. You just need to lose less than anyone else in the room. So, what are we going to talk about today? But before that, few general caveats and disclaimers before we begin. First one, which I have to say before every lecture, I didn't make up most of the things you're going to see. I am just a deliverer. I'm going to try my best to give credit when I can, but I don't have the pretense to say that this is originally mine necessarily. Secondly, I am going to intentionally use quite a lot of examples in this workshop to make things more intuitive. Please do not infer from any of these examples that they necessarily reflect my opinion of subjects. We are going to, in some cases, analyze one side of a debate as an example. It does not mean that this is the side that I support in real life. It just means that this is the side that was convenient for me for the purposes of the workshop. Thirdly, regarding streaming, I consent for this to be streamed. I want this to be as available for as many people to participate and see this later on. However, since I do aim for this workshop to be quite interactive, there are going to be parts in which you're also involved. What I'm going to request is, A, please leave questions in any case to the end, or alternatively, write them in the chat. Do not unmute yourself to ask a question. And secondly, particularly in the parts in which we are going to make interactive, that is, I will ask you questions, please only participate and answer if you consent to be streamed yourselves. I am going to leave a part for a Q&A at the end of the workshop to let everyone a chance to participate, and this particular part will not be streamed if you do not wish it to be streamed. However, to not need to cut a workshop midway and for us to be able to upload it to be available to as many people as possible, I'd appreciate if everyone who participates during the workshop itself are people who are conceding to be streamed. With that in mind, what are we going to talk about today? So, some stuff that we're going to cover in this workshop. Firstly, identifying the problem. What is the issue of being comparative in debates? Why it is important? Why most of you don't in fact do it today? Secondly, we're going to discuss constructive analysis and how to be comparative while making it. Thirdly, how to be comparative, particularly in engagement, which is also something that is often neglected and arguably more important even than being comparative in analysis. And lastly, when should we or shouldn't we use comparative analysis in our speeches? Not always. This is the scheme that we want to use for every single argument. We'll discuss that more next during the workshop. Starting with identifying the problem. So first, just a general idea of why we want to be comparative. Debates, quite inherently, tend to have a trade-off within them, or at least A teams try their best to make debates balanced, meaning that there usually are two sides for each debate, which means that rarely can you actually win a debate by just proving your side to be good and the opposing side to be bad. Most debaters, in fact, try to do just that. We are going to prove everything and we are going to rebut everything. It is nearly never possible. There are always bullets to bite, meaning that usually, and especially in higher rooms, the path to victory has to go through a trade-off, has to go through your ability to be comparative and make your side sound compelling comparatively more than the opposing side. You can't win them all. Secondly, when speeches aren't comparative, you leave it for the panel to decide which was in fact more compelling. That is, if you want to spoon-feed the panel, if you don't want to leave it for the discussion of the adjudicators to decide this argument was more compelling than the other, it is directly in your incentive to be, from the get-go, comparative and explain why your arguments are not only good, but are better than the other side. For anyone who has some experience adjudicating debates, you might already know that we are instructed as judges to be comparative in how we judge debates. There is no objective automate first or automate fourth. An argument being good doesn't constitute a win, an argument being bad doesn't constitute a loss. And it will help you therefore winning by showing why your side is not only good, but better than the alternative. Thirdly, it is important to know, because I think a lot of us just don't realize it, most of us are, most of the time, are in fact not being comparative. Most often, we claim to be when we are in fact not. We claim to do weighings when we do impact. How often maybe you have encountered the claim of a speaker saying, I'm going to weigh my argument and explain why it is the most important in the room, to then go on and just explain, here are 3 different reasons why this argument is important. An argument being important does not equate an argument being the most important in the room. That is an uncomparative way to weigh an argument. We claim that we compare to the alternative in the debate, when in most likelihood, we just give our own arguments and try to rebut the opposition. This is, again, not in fact being comparative. So the first most important thing to understand before we actually go more deeply into how to do it correctly is that being comparative is a mindset more than anything else. It is actively trying to actually weigh or compare against the opposing side. It is getting into the mindset of proving better rather than good, of proving worse rather than bad. So far as to what we are going to learn today. How, in fact, are we going to do that? So, some general advice as to how to be comparative in your analysis. The first one, and I am indebted to Ayal Hayutman for this, use a chart. That is, obviously not when you give your speeches. Please don't do the stuff where you take a literal board and write stuff on it, because this is not how we do debates, though it's really funny. But rather, when you write your arguments on a sheet, don't make a list. Make a chart with 2 sides for it. One for the opposing side, one for your own. Sometimes I've received the question of, does it matter which side is which? I usually advise making the opposing on the left and your side on the right. That is just because of the intuitive way in which we analyze arguments as problem and solution. So we want to show, here's why a bad thing happens on their side, and here's why it is fixed with a good thing on ours. But this is just my preference. It is less important than the actual realization that you want to analyze your arguments on 2 sides of each argument. We're going to give several examples of this soon. Secondly, when you make the comparison, make it as direct as possible. Compare by the same criterions under the same metric. To give an example of what I mean here, in the debate, this house prefers, behind the veil of ignorance, to be born in a wealthy autocracy rather than a poor democracy. Say that we are on opposition side. Say that the argument or the metric for comparison that we chose is the metric of quality of life. Maybe some of you would think to use the following comparison of quality of life. Yeah, wealthy autocracies might have more money, but it is comparatively better to be under a poor democracy because you have more individual freedoms that are important for your quality of life, such as marrying who you want, wearing what you want, working in your preferred occupation, etc. This is not how we in fact want to be comparative in our analysis. And the reason for this is while we did choose the same metric of quality of life, we use different criterions under the same metric. One of them is money, and the other is personal freedom in life choices. This does not help the panel actually compare which of the 2 is more important or preferable. A better way to make a comparison is to choose the same criterion. So, for example, the criterion of money. Yes, in wealthy autocracies, the country might be richer, but the distribution of the money doesn't actually reach to the most of the people involved in the country. It usually doesn't trickle down to the lower class. Whereas under a democracy, because we hold people accountable under the government, even if it has less money, it is more likely to reach at the end of the day to my own pocket. This is comparing on the exact same criterion and therefore makes for a more comparative claim. Third part, to analyzing in a comparative manner. Make the connection immediate rather than by the end of the argument. What do I mean by this? What I've often noticed debaters do when they try to analyze using the scheme of this chart on the opposing side and on our side is, here is a list of things that happen on the opposing side, and now here is a list of solutions on how it happens on our side. The reason why we don't want to do it this way is, despite the fact that content-wise you are indeed being comparative, it is hard for the judges to make the connection between the problems and the solutions that you describe. It is usually preferable to make the connection immediate. Problem 1, solution 1. Problem 2, solution 2. So rather than a list, we want to make the immediate connection right away. This, by the way, also saves time, because usually making a list and then repeating the exact opposite of this list again takes more time than showing the two sides of the same criterion immediately one after another. This might sound a bit unintuitive now. I'm going to show you soon an example that I hopefully will make it more intuitive. Next, try to use a wide myriad of criterions to compare by. That is, for each metric you choose, take several criterions that you can use for comparison. The reason for this is, you do not want to appear to be cherry picking. If we take only one criterion of comparison for each metric, it is very easy for judges and for the opposing side to claim, well, yeah, maybe you're comparatively better on this metric, but you're cherry picking the one that is easier for you to compare. So you usually want to choose many of them to compare by. However, please note, still use those under the same metric. What do I mean by this? You never want an argument in general, not only in the subject of this particular workshop, to be the debate. My argument will be the motion is good. This is usually a way to make your arguments not sufficiently analyzed because you're trying to shove a lot of different arguments in one. Similarly here, this chart shouldn't be, I'm going to make each of my arguments on both sides of this chart. You want to make it separate for each individual argument, and each individual argument should have different bottom lines and thus different metrics. However, the same way we have multiple reasonings for each argument in general, we want to have multiple criterions of comparison under each metric. And the last thing, which is rather stylistic but still important, be relative rather than absolute in your analysis as well as your rhetoric. In the choice of words, choose to say more, better, the best. Choose terminology that in it already has a comparison, rather than terminology which is not comparing to any other side, such as good, bad, whatever goes on along those lines. Now, let's see a few examples to understand actually more intuitively how it works. Okay, so first example, based on round 8 from the recent Thailand WUDC. This one I'm going to walk you step by step through the analysis that I gave at the time. We're going to later have a couple of examples where we're going to have them more interactive, and I'm going to ask you to help me analyze. So, for the example here, this house believes that the feminist movement should support the narrative that beauty doesn't matter over the narrative that all bodies are beautiful. Specifically, the argument that I choose to focus on here, because as I've said earlier, we want to focus on one argument and not the entire debate, is the argument of which narrative is more compelling. So the bottom line is, the incentive for us in general is for the feminist movement to be able to advocate for its narrative. So it is our incentive to choose the narrative that is more likely to actually persuade people. Specifically for this example, I chose opposition, mainly for the reason that I was opposition when I debated this, but happy to also later on try and analyze with you in practice the opposing side for this. So, on opposition, and on the argument of which narrative is more likely to be compelling or have buying. I offer 4 criterions under this exact metric to compare by. So, first, which is more believable based on our intuition? On the one hand, beauty doesn't matter is not likely to be believable because most of us do know that we value beauty in the day-to-day. We value it, most of us, in our sexual attraction. We value it in our aesthetic preferences. We value it just by the fact that most of us do have a value of art, music, and different things by things that have a beauty related to them. And we also value them in human beings most often. However, on the opposing side, we are likely to believe that all bodies are beautiful because we are used to the fact that our evaluation of beauty is subjective. Like most of us have this idea of this person is not my type. We do have the idea that our preferences are not always aligning with what is the norm or the standard that is expected to be. So it is kind of intuitive to us that all bodies can be beautiful, but it is very not intuitive to us that beauty doesn't matter at all. Second criterion for comparison. Based on our lived experiences, we can't believe that beauty doesn't matter because we have seen in effect that it had mattered for us. The fact that we were good or bad looking according to society impacted us based on bullying, discrimination, dating, etc. However, we can very easily believe, based on our lived experience, that everyone can be beautiful because everyone felt beautiful at times at least. We all had our wedding or prom day, this special dress that made us feel good, or just someone, our significant other, that told us that they think we are beautiful. This led us to believe that we can be beautiful no matter who we are in society. So we cannot believe that our beauty doesn't have an impact, but we can believe that we all can be beautiful. Third criterion of comparison, susceptibility. We don't want to believe beauty doesn't matter because usually it had a meaning for us. It gave us times where it mattered to us in terms of us feeling pretty and gaining confidence of it. Sometimes we had this feeling of when we used makeup and it made us feel better and actually confident to go to a job interview afterwards. We don't want something to take this away for us. We don't want to believe this narrative because we have good memories associated with valuing beauty. However, we are extremely susceptible to the narrative that all bodies are beautiful. All of us want to feel like we also deserve to feel beautiful. All of us want to believe that we can be pretty if we just change our perception of what beauty is. So we're extremely susceptible to this message. And fourth criterion, cooperation with other narratives in society. Particularly here I chose the beauty industry. The beauty industry probably has a bit more resources, unfortunately, than the feminist movement, and they have all the incentive to fight back against the narrative that beauty doesn't matter because it's kind of detrimental to their business. The makeup, the clothing, the plastic surgeries industries don't want anyone to believe beauty doesn't matter, and they will invest most of their advertisements against it. And it is hard for us as a feminist movement to win them on the battle of ideas given our limited resources. However, with the narrative of all bodies are beautiful, we don't have to fight them, we can work together. They can appear to be woke by integrating plus-size models or trans models and models that are not always aligning with the traditional standards of beauty. It is even often their incentive to just say everyone can be beautiful if they just buy our products. They don't want people to believe that you can't be beautiful given a certain birth characteristic you have. They have the incentive for everyone to believe that they technically can be beautiful. For all those reasons, on comparison, it is much more likely that we are able to convince people that all bodies are beautiful than we are to convince them that beauty doesn't matter. Now, before I move on to the next few examples, I want to show how in this I implemented the basic rules that we discussed in the earlier slide. Firstly, I did all of this not in a manner of list and then the other list. I didn't read out all the 4 reasons that beauty doesn't matter and then the 4 reasons that all bodies are beautiful, but rather I made the direct ping pong of the problem and the solution on our side immediately to create the intuitive connection. Secondly, I used a myriad of different criterions, but all of them under the same metric of which is more compelling, to make it appear both as not cherry picking, but still comparative rather than trying to compare between competing metrics. So this is the basic idea of how we do that. Next, I want us to do a bit more of an interactive practice on two more arguments that I would want you to do together with me. So just a sec. All right, for the motion, this House believes that Bernie Sanders would have been better than Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee or presidential nominee. Specifically, the metric that I want us to choose here is electability. I intentionally wish to focus on a particular metric. We can do other metrics later on if you want. And we are on government side. We are on the side supporting Sanders being better for the Democratic presidential nominee, and we want to prove Sanders is comparatively more electable or more likely to get voters turnout in their favor rather than Joe Biden. I have some ideas of how to analyze it that I'm going to reveal later to give you some ideas, but before that, I want you all to take 2 or 3 minutes to think of how you yourself would prove it, and we can go over it together soon. So take a couple of minutes to think how you would analyze that. Take 1 more minute. All right, do I have any volunteers who are brave enough to offer at least one criterion of comparison that they found?
Can I try?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Probably in terms of like electability, in terms of probably like women, because like Biden has certain sexual assault allegations against him. So that could mean that Bernie Sanders is more electable from that like demographic.
All right, I think that's one good example to use. I think you probably also want to just complete the other side of it, or the flip side. So you have why Biden is not likely to be electable by women, and then you want to fill in the flip side of why Sanders is likely to be electable by women. So he's associated with feminism, etc., whichever analysis on those grounds.
So yeah, so Bernie Sanders is like, first of all, like on the other hand, like from Biden, he doesn't really have anything. He doesn't really have any like allegations against him, so he's well accepted by that community, and he is also, like he also does appeal to many like feminists or like feminist voters in the United States.
All right.
So like,
cool. I think next also Nitin raised hand earlier.
Oh, yes, I did. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So, like the stakeholder I was thinking about was basically the African American community, So if you look at Biden's past criminal justice record, it is often a tough on crime narrative, and he often has quite a bad track record on criminal justice, especially supporting things such as war on drugs, especially which actually like hurts black communities. So which makes him less of an electability candidate, as opposed to Bernie Sanders, who has a structural criminal justice reform plan to combat mass incarceration, and has also been an initial critic of it. So it's more likely to gather votes in that particular stakeholder community.
All right. I think this analytically works. Just a word of advice, which is not very much related to the topic of this particular workshop, but for the argument in general. It might be worthwhile noting that in real life, statistically, this is a bit inaccurate. That is, Biden actually has quite a lot of reach among African-American communities because he's still associated with Obama. Not related to this subject, but just a general note of, usually we want to also choose arguments that we are likely to also have as intuitive in real life, rather than ones that are easy to analyze in debate land. But I do think analytically it does work and follow the rules we discussed. Julia, do you want to go next?
Cool. So I guess one thing that you could talk about is basically just their ability to excite people and get people involved in the political process. So Biden, for example, is often seen as being a cop-out, is often seen as just doing whatever Obama did and not necessarily having his own ideas, and also not necessarily going to the left enough or being willing to, like, quote unquote, fight for the Democrats, and is just trying to do whatever he can to get the most votes. However, on the contrast, Bernie Sanders is much more energizing, and oftentimes he is able to, especially with young people, engage them in politics and get them to support him, and not only just do things like come out to vote, but also come to rallies and try and get other people to support Sanders. And especially in a world where voter turnout is quite low, you can argue that that would be quite important.
All right. I like this example because I think it's educational. I want to flag, I'm also going to soon reveal the arguments that I gave, and I think they have quite an overlap with what Julia just mentioned. But I want us to take a note at few things that we can learn from this particular example. Firstly, I think Julia gave two good criterions that were mistakenly mixed as one. The first one is the fact that Sanders is more exciting in general, and the second one is that Sanders caters more to younger voters. Both could be correct and good metrics, from good criterions to compare by, but are different criterions that we want to proactively separate when we make this analysis, just so we can make the comparison more direct by each one separately. So firstly, Biden is less exciting, therefore less people are likely to turn out and vote for him, whereas for Sanders, because he's perceived as more different, more people are likely to actually go out and vote, and maybe even turn into activism. Secondly, Biden is appealing more to an older audience, Bernie is appealing more to a younger audience, which we want to tend to more because they have the lower voter turnout in the first place, so we need them more to give them the active push. This is the first thing that I want to flag in terms of what to learn from this example. A second thing that I think is important is making sure to directly connect our analysis back to the criterion or the metric for comparison. Particularly in this case, we talked about electability. So we had Biden being less exciting than Sanders. This does not yet explain why it makes him more electable. Arguably, you could say, someone who is less exciting after the very anti-establishment, very exciting Trump that many Democrats tend to not like, is a very good, optimistic, boring future that many Americans dream of today. So it is worthwhile to do the extra step of connecting excitement and turnout to actually show someone who is not exciting, someone who is not very unique or interesting, is just not likely to be worthwhile to go out to the ballot for, because maybe he is not different enough from Republicans, so why bother? Because maybe, yeah, he's nice, but he's not great, so it's not giving me the active motivation that I need to go out and vote. Whereas on comparison, someone who is actually different and motivating is more likely to actually lead to action. I'm going to take two more responses and then we're going to move on. So Haringanesh, sorry if I butchered the name.
It's fine. I was just thinking it could be on student debt because Biden just wants to make community college debt free, but Sanders actually proposed a plan to like cancel all student loan debt. I actually think students would be more likely to prefer Sanders because they won't actually care how he does it. All they care that it's done, right? So there's a lot of student debt in America.
All right. I will note then that the next thing to take from here, I think students could definitely be a good stakeholder to compare by, but the thing to note here is that it is not enough to say students care about students' debt at the point at which we said both candidates have a policy regarding student debt. But it is important to explain why students are likely to prefer specifically Sanders' policy rather than Biden's policy, which is the more important link for comparison here. And last one that I'm going to take for this question is Arsen.
So it is about debate performance and direct engagement with Trump because Biden is perceived as sleepy, often mumbling and gaffing, and he is less likely to have a very good performance against Trump. He's very likely to lose to him in a debate, and therefore it weakens his electability compared to Bernie, who is very passionate and active speaker, who will more likely appear to be winning over Trump in their 3 presidential debates that are coming.
All right, great. I think we had quite a few good examples here. Just to reveal my own initial analysis. Yeah, so the first and the last examples that I gave are quite overlapping with what Julia said. That is, being perceived as less similar, more different, or more exciting, and the last one being more catering to the younger voters. And I also added particularly the metric of comparison of which stakeholder is actually more likely to compromise. So one thought of how to do this is Biden is particularly more popular among moderate Democrats. Sanders is more popular among the more radical or leftist Democrats. Because they are more radical, they are likely to be more hardline ideologues, therefore less willing to compromise for the lesser evil, and therefore not likely to choose Biden even with the alternative of Trump, whereas those who are moderate are more likely to be compromising and therefore vote for either candidate anyway, so long as they are not Trump. So those are some ideas as how to do this. Next example to analyze together. This house prefers a world without religion. Here again, I am going to ask you to have a specific metric. So we are going to be opposition. We are on the side that prefers a world with religion rather than a world without it. And the metric for comparison is moral. Which has a more moral world? So here again, take 2 to 3 minutes to think of which criterions of comparison under the metric of morality you would choose in favor of having religion rather than not having it. Take 2 to 3 minutes. 1 more minute. All right, do I have any brave volunteers that can offer criterions to compare by, specifically on the metric of morality? So, Andrei, go.
Hi. I thought about two things when I was thinking about the motion. So, if we define religion as some kind of a divine authority, then for the opposition side, I'm thinking about religion as a preventive mechanism for potential crimes, as in, if there is something that can punish us for our sins, then most probably I would not be doing the things that can be considered as sins because I do not want to be punished. Thus, we have a preventive mechanism for such things. Well, this doesn't exist in the governmental side.
Just a sec.
Of course.
So I think this is actually a good example in which we did one side of the comparison without the other. That is, I think Andrei analyzed well why with religion people care about not doing crime, but not so much why without religion they don't. I think a very accessible response from opposition would be to say, there are so many alternatives. Like, you have literally the law that can put you in prison. You have just general social norms. You have just innate morality in people due to biology and empathy, etc. What is so unique about religion? So here, this is a good example of when we analyze one side, that is the world with religion, but not the other side of the world without it. Anyone has any idea how we can analyze that without religion, people won't care so much about doing crimes?
Can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, so in a world without religion, what will inherently happen is they won't feel this sort of like this duty, or they won't feel like they have to abide by this set of like rules from like an upper or like a higher power or something, because when they believe in that, then they do everything like in terms of whether it's like whether the higher power would accept that or not. So something like crime isn't like so when they're in a world without religion, they don't necessarily believe in this sort of like this sort of organized religion, so they won't feel they have this duty, and hence
You're using the words not or without religion, but essentially, and by the way, to be clear, I'm not doing anything here to shame anyone. I think this is a very common mistake, and it's good that we get to it. In fact, the analysis here isn't about why without religion we don't have moral, but only about why with religion we have it. Because you have a high power, because you have general structure, etc. This still doesn't explain why there couldn't be alternatives. The same response that I flagged before, but there is a high power. It's called the state, or it's called societal norms, or your biological instincts. This explanation is still not comparative to those, and does not explain why religion uniquely actually offers something that those things don't. Harshvardhan, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So the idea is basically there are a huge number of temptations that you easily want to give into at any point in time. So those moderating influences don't seem to apply to you because you always think that you're the exception or you won't be caught. Even if you want to believe that, these are things that you think you can do in the long term, or things that you sideline for much more instantaneous considerations. On the flip side, when there's religion, it's an incentive for supernatural power that you either rot in hell or you get salvation at the point which you believe in it. And also the fact that there's a constant community reminding you to do things. Lastly, just like people hate secular legal systems and they feel their reach doesn't apply to them. We think this God is like God and religion as such is an everlasting sort of alternative, which is always with you.
All right. This is, I think, a very good example. In fact, there's two separate criterions which were made comparatively. The first one is accountability or fear of being caught, in which we say, on the one hand, on the world without religion, people have optimism bias. They know that many people don't get caught, especially in, so we can maybe even develop it into saying, especially in crimes that are much harder to get caught for in the first place, such as sexual violence, etc. And even if you do get caught, you know that there is a limited penalty, etc. In contrast, with religion, you have the ultimate supervision. God watches you all the time. You know that you are 100% going to get caught. There's no escaping the punishment, and the penalty is literally eternity in hell. Of course, the deterrence for making crime or immoral acts is much higher. So this is one criterion, the deterrence or the accountability. A second criterion that was provided here is the idea of exceptions. Without religion, nearly all moral values could be perceived as having exceptions, as though we can justify our own situation by different manners. Whereas with religion, you have an absolute objective morality that you cannot escape from. I think these are good ideas. Anyone have other comparative criterions to offer? Andre is raising hand again, but I want to see if there are people who didn't yet offer their ideas. All right, if no one else wants to, then Andre, go.
One of the things that I thought about is the use of religion by authoritarian states, like the states, like the government of Russia or Poland, that are using religion in their narrative to provide hate speech. And thus, without the religion in the world, that would not be possible.
Right, this is already a separate argument for the opposing bench, if I understood correctly. So for this practice, we are staying as opposition, that is, we do support religion, and we support it specifically for moral reasons. So if you want, we can go later also to the opposing side and discuss things that we can say in favor of a world without religion. For now, I see Julia is raising her hand. Julia, do you have an idea of a criterion to compare by?
I'm not completely sure, but I think something that you could draw upon is the aspect of community within religion, because without religion, even though there are other actors which can provide community, it is often not to the same extent as religion, because you don't have things like you meet once a week all the time, or you constantly feel connected to each other because you're often doing the same thing even when you aren't meeting. So thus, without religion, you don't necessarily feel like people will be as disappointed in you if you do something bad. However, with religion, I think that it's more likely to happen because you know that there are people who are very close to you, and especially in terms of morals, you know that they will be extremely disappointed in you.
Sure, I think that's a good criterion to compare by. The criterion of constant reinforcements of morality. Without religion, people generally have morals, but they don't discuss it on a day-to-day basis. It is not a big part of their community. They do not actually judge one another based on it very often. With religion, we discuss moral very often. It is part of our gatherings on the weekends. It is part of how we evaluate other humans. It is part of our stories and our rituals and what we care about in the day-to-day. So we have much more constant reinforcements. That's a good criterion to compare by. I'm going to take one last answer and then we're going to move on. So, Olha?
Okay, I thought about, do we actually need a moral in the society? So without religion, we can say about the freedom of choice. It's wider than involved with religion, but in comparison, we can say that involved with religion provides us better choices, like not to kill baby, abortion, because the religion cares about you, and this morality, and society needs this morality.
So just so I understand better, I get what you say about why there is morality within religion. What is the flip side of it? That is, why don't people have someone to care about them or some values without it?
Some people don't actually listen to the social moral social norms, but religion is they give you answers. It gives you answers.
All right. So I think the criterion that you're aiming for here, if I understood correctly, is just knowledge. Like, without religion, people really do not know what is and isn't moral. The fact that the state has done something or the society has told me something doesn't make it right. With religion, I have an absolute omniscient God that knows exactly what is and isn't moral, so I have more credibility for them and more reason to actually listen. Did I understand you correctly?
Yep, thank you.
All right. So I'm not going to take much longer with my proposals because in fact we already mentioned all of them. So my suggested 3 criterions from the get-go was firstly the subjectivity, whether or compared to the objectivity of religion. So this is similar to what Harshvardhan said before about the fact that we are more likely to think of ourselves as exception. It is more easy for us to rationalize immoral actions, saying things such as he had it coming, I had different circumstances, etc. Whereas with religion, morality is objective and absolute, and therefore sin cannot be justified or rationalized. Second thing was the accountability that we also mentioned. Most people get away without a punishment without religion. With religion, you have divine providence. You cannot get away with it. And lastly, the one that we just flagged, that the source of morality without religion is one that is questionable and can make mistakes, like the state or society, whereas religion cannot be questioned. It is an unquestionable and omniscient source that definitely knows the right answers. Cool. Moving on then to the question of engagement. And how can we be comparative when we do that? So the first thing, and it kind of goes without saying, but still important for me to say, engage. There is absolutely no way in which you can argue to be comparative if you do not engage. If you only talk about your own constructive without directly weighing or rebutting the other side, you're not being comparative. You're analyzing one side of the equation. So that's an important thing to say. Secondly, and these, the second and third parts are actually not very intuitive, and we're going to go into depth with examples about them soon. Engage on the same metrics as provided by your opponent. So, to give an example of what to do and what not to do, actually, I'm going to give the example soon in the next slide. So just remember this. You want to answer on the same metric. That is, if they gave a metric that their argument is about, don't say, well, they claimed X, but we proved Y, which is more important. Actually engage X, win on the opposing side metric. This is the way to be actually comparative. Secondly, use direct refutation rather than competing analysis. So that says 2 things. Firstly, a common thing that I've noticed recently in debating, a common trend, most people, rather than saying, these are the 3 reasons that they gave, here is why they are wrong, instead they say, they said 3 reasons X is right. We will give 3 reasons X is wrong. This is called competing analysis, which is a non-comparative way to do rebuttal. Because what then becomes the case is you leave it for the panel to decide which of the competing lines of analysis is more compelling. The 3 original reasons given by the opposing side still in fact remain standing. Whereas a more comparative way to engage will be to give direct analysis, to rebut not only the bottom line, but the analysis given by the opposing side. It will all be more intuitive soon when we go through the examples. But this also means a second thing. If possible, avoid integrated rebuttals. So there are caveats to that. That is, for the question, I'm going to flag what the third point means very soon again when I'm going through the examples. Just the rule of thumb for now, avoid integrated rebuttals. The reason for this is when we say our case is in direct clash with the opposing side, and we think that this means our case refutes the opposing side, in fact, it doesn't. 2 arguments can exist on the same clash and clash one another without directly refuting. Both claims on the same question can be true. And again, it leaves it for the panel to decide which is more compelling. A direct externalized rebuttal is more likely to actually directly engage not only on the clash, but on the actual analysis provided. Fourth thing, on weighings. acknowledge that weighings are not the same thing as impacts. And I think here, the main thing to remember is what I've said earlier about rhetorics. Something as simple as changing your terminology from good to better or the best is going to make your weighings much better. Don't weigh by, here are 3 reasons why my argument is important. This is not a way to make a weighing. This explains why the argument is important. Note why it is more important than the other argument, which is what weighings are supposed to do. Rather, explain why your argument is most important. It has the most relevant stakeholder, it influences the most people, it is logically prior, any metric of weighing you can think of. And lastly, be charitable. Engage the strongest version of the case rather than a straw man of it or a mitigated version of it. The reason why we do this to be comparative is if we only engage the mitigated version of the opposing side's argument, we try to do exactly what we discussed that we want to avoid at the beginning of this lecture, and that is, we have only good things, they have only bad things, which is nearly never the case. Part of being comparative and actually winning on comparison against the fact that we still need to bite the bullet is accepting it, is giving the most charitable reading to the opposing side's argument and winning that version of the argument. Now, I'm going to give a few examples with hopefully explaining a bit more what I think the least intuitive parts of what I just said, which is the second and third part. So that is engaging on the same metrics and engaging on the direct analysis rather than competing analysis. So, first example. In this example, I'm going to show to you an argument and 3 different ways to rebut it. One of those will be a competing metric, that is giving a rebuttal on a different metric than the original argument. The second one will be on competing analysis, so on the same metric, but not answering the analysis, but rather offering an alternative analysis. And the last one will be an actual direct rebuttal that offers comparative engagement. So, for the motion, this House believes that environmental advocacy groups should prioritize lobbying governments to change environmental policies rather than convincing individuals to take responsibility for their own contribution to environmental damage. Opposition in this debate gives the following argument. It is easier to convince individuals to change their behavior than it is to convince governments to change their policies. Because to pass a law, you need to convince a majority of members of parliament, whereas to change one's behavior, you only need to convince one person at a time. 3 different rebuttals to this. First one, politicians have much more impact on the environment than individuals do. With the raise of your hand, who can explain to me what is the problem with this rebuttal? I know that I wrote on screen that it is competing metric. Try to explain to me why. Why is it not actually answering the metric offered? Zahari, go.
Because it doesn't answer the idea that it's really hard to convince politicians. So even if they do have impact, that doesn't mean that they will use it in a good way.
Yep. In other words, it offers a competing metric, doesn't actually engage the original one. What is the metric offered by opposition's argument? Who can tell me? What is the metric for comparison they offer here? What is the bottom line of their argument?
Can I?
Go.
Yeah, I think it's in terms of like how easy it is to convince.
Yeah. So the metric by opposition is ease of convincing, whereas the metric of the rebuttal is, Udhai?
The metric of the rebuttal is the impact of
Exactly.
politicians versus an individual.
So that's one way of a common way to do rebuttals, which is not in fact being comparative. A second way, which is a bit more nuanced, but still in fact is competing analysis, is the following. It is actually easier to convince politicians than individuals, because individuals have to make personal sacrifices, like not use their own cars, but rather use public transportation, when politicians don't directly pay for environmental legislations, it goes out of taxpayers' money. This is the same metric. Opposition gave an argument about ease of convincing, and we gave another argument on ease of convincing. Can anyone tell me with the raise of your hands why it is still not directly engaging? Olha.
No, I'm not ready, sorry.
All right, anyone else? I see Udhai is voting, but I want to see if there are more hands. Anyone else who can maybe identify the problem with this rebuttal? Zahari?
Because it doesn't engage with the idea that you need to convince a majority of politicians, but can convince one person at a time. So it's a competing analysis, but doesn't actually say that you actually need to convince all the people to change their behavior.
In other words, both arguments can stay true at the same time. It is very possible that on the one hand, you need to convince more MPs to get a result. And on the other hand, MPs individually are easier to persuade because they don't have personal stake in the game. Fair enough. Which is more important for ease of convincing? No one in the debate tells me. What am I to do with it as an adjudicator? So a good rule of thumb here is, always ask yourself the following question. After my rebuttal, is the original argument still true or can still be true? If the answer is yes, you're giving competing analysis rather than direct refutation. So, one example for how to make direct refutation in this particular example would be convincing just one MP can actually be a big deal. You don't need to get a majority of parliament because environmental regulations are not huge legislations. They are usually small regulations that pass in committees rather than a legislative majority vote. These committees tend to be small, have few MPs and only one prominent person in charge. It is enough to convince them to actually get the change you need. You don't need a majority vote for most of these day-to-day regulations. This is an example of how we directly refute the original argument. Now, to be clear, the competing analysis or the competing metric offered here could be good arguments. I'm not saying don't do them. I think potentially the strongest argument in this debate for government is that politicians have much higher impact than individuals. But this is a constructive argument. This is for your case. Make it separate from your rebuttal. Always make sure to divide your risks and that regardless of your arguments, the opposing side's arguments are just not standing. So do the competing analysis, but don't rebut using the competing analysis. Okay, a couple of more examples based on the previous arguments that we analyzed together. So, first argument that we analyzed together, or less, doesn't matter, I didn't do it by order. Religious morality is better because it's not prone to rationalizations. Note, I know that we gave I gave in the original chart like 3 different reasons why religious morality is better. I intentionally focus here on one. So, for the reason that religious morality is better because it's not prone to rationalization, one way to rebut it would be to say, religious morality is actually worse because it has bad values in it, like misogyny and homophobia. With the raise of your hands, who can tell me why this is not an effective rebuttal? Olha?
I suppose that these bad values are not about rationalizations. So these are different things. That's why it's not the same. So it's not the answer.
In other words, both could be true at the same time. So yeah, possibly there are also bad moral values in religion, which could be a very good argument for your constructive side in the debate. But the argument that says, regardless any other morality is easy to rationalize and therefore abused for bad reasons still stands. A direct rebuttal in comparison could say, religious morality is very prone to rationalizations. Like, we literally have different interpretations and people whose literal job is to make different interpretations of the religious verdicts. It is only worse, in fact, under the exact same metric of rationalization because it has the veil of objectivity. At least when you rationalize your morality, you know that you do that. But when you listen blindly to religion, it is more likely that you can make rationalizations or that people can make rationalizations for you in the form of interpretations, but you will not be critical towards it. Second example. For the argument we gave earlier, Sanders' voter base is more radical and therefore less compromising, so we need to ensure their vote. We need to give them a stronger reason to actually go out and vote. The rebuttal is, Biden is actually more electable than Sanders because he's moderate, and therefore most voters are more likely to choose him because most voters are moderate. Who can explain to me what is the problem with this rebuttal? Julia?
I think what might be the problem is the fact that Sanders' voter base can be more radical, and Biden can also have, so Sanders can have the support of more radical people, and Biden can have the support of more moderate people, but that doesn't deal with like who will be more electable necessarily, because both can be true.
In other words, reminding again the rule of thumb, can the original argument stay true after this rebuttal? The answer is yes. And in fact, the original argument already preempts our rebuttal here. Because in this particular example, even if majority of the voter base is moderate, according to the original argument, doesn't matter, because moderates are more likely to compromise, so they will vote Biden or Sanders anyway. Radicals are the ones that are less compromising and we need to ensure their vote. In comparison, a direct rebuttal could be, radicals are actually more likely to compromise, seeing as because they are radical leftists, anything is better to Trump, according to them. Whereas moderates are more likely to swing right. The assumption or the premise of the argument that says the people who are moderates are more compromising and therefore they will always choose a Democrat is just not true. At the point at which they are moderate, they might be closer to Trump than they are to someone as radical as Biden. Sanders. Calling Biden's radical is the funniest thing I've ever done in debate, I think. Cool. So far for engagement. When should and when shouldn't we use comparative analysis? Now, I know that it sounds unintuitive and mostly generally in debates, we want to say that our workshops are applicable to nearly every debate, and also we want to believe that every argument should be comparative. However, while every debate is comparative, not every argument is. Not every argument has a trade-off in it. I'd posit that in fact, most arguments don't. For example, most principled arguments are not about a direct trade-off. Like, yeah, you can make an argument which is a weighing of rights, but the basic analysis for why something is a right in the first place is an absolute question. It is not in a trade-off compared to something else. Most arguments that we make in debates don't have a trade-off built in them. And therefore, we should analyze them by our other schemes, burdens of proof, whatever you use, rather than do it in a chart. Secondly, even if an argument has a trade-off, we are not going to use this particular form of analysis, of comparative analysis, if the main question or the main question that is contestable about the argument is the existence of the trade-off rather than which side is preferable. So as an example, in the earlier debate that we discussed about Biden versus Sanders, this is, by the way, again, an example of a debate is always of a trade-off, but an argument not always is. So yes, the debate has the trade-off of Sanders versus Biden, but in most cases, the argument that explains why Sanders would make for a better president than Biden is not going to be a very strategically smart argument to focus on. Because the more likely question to be contested in the debate, the thing that is more likely to be on clash, is not who makes a better president, but rather who has more of a likelihood to become a president in the first place, given the comparison of Trump and the left-wing bubble that is debating when no one wants to defend the world with Trump. So we can use the scheme of comparative analysis on comparing why Sanders just have better policies than Biden, but we probably shouldn't, despite the fact that we can. Thirdly, we don't use comparative analysis before we established the existence of a trade-off in the first place. As an example of this, black market arguments. So black market arguments will always have a burden inside them that is comparative, which is, why is the black market worse than the legal one? Which is not a trivial burden, right? Like, I could arguably say in a debate about legalizing all drugs, I don't care if a black market of heroin exists. Heroin is so bad enough in and of itself that I'd rather have less of it than even have the less that is left, a black market version of it, because regulation can't make heroin better. So yes, definitely, there is a trade-off burden within the argument. But if I were to just analyze throughout my whole speech why heroin in the black market is worse than a regulated version, what is the problem with this? Can anyone tell me with a raise of your hands? Julia?
You haven't proved that the black market will actually exist.
I didn't yet prove that this trade-off exists in the first place, that we are solving some black market on either side of the table. So even when there is an existence of a trade-off, make sure that you prove first the existence of the trade-off rather than go directly to analyzing which on the trade-off is better. This is, by the way, very true also for nearly every regret motion, in which usually the two main clashes in most regret debates will be A, what is the likely counterfactual, and B, is the counterfactual better or worse than the status quo? Many people go directly to explain why the counterfactual is better without doing the first crucial step of why this counterfactual is even likely. So we don't want to assume the trade-off, we want to prove it before we actually get to analyze it. And the note to remember here, sometimes the trade-off within the argument is one burden of it rather than the entirety of the argument. So it is important, like the whole thing that we did about the chart and how to structure your analysis, etc., make it specific to what you want to analyze. So in the example of the black market argument, I would definitely use the chart to analyze why the black market is worse than the regulated one. I will not use it to explain why the black market exists, because this is not a comparative claim to make. This is a claim about the world. This is me trying to explain that people have sufficient incentives to do it and sufficient ways to not get caught, even if it is legal. Nothing of it is comparing to an alternative reality. So A, always focus your trade-off analysis on the actual burden that has a trade-off, and B, always make sure that your analysis, as we said already at the beginning of the workshop, is concrete to the specific metric, the specific argument that you are having, not the whole debate. Never do the thing of, here's my chart, when on the one hand is with the motion and on the other hand is without the motion, when the bottom line is why the motion is good. Why the motion is good is usually not a good argument because it's like 5 different arguments in one. When should we use comparative analysis? So the obvious answer, like logically, is when a trade-off exists. There are some guidelines for when we can identify that a trade-off does exist, and probably using this chart or this way to analyze, or this structure of analysis is useful. So firstly, as I've already said, every regret motion. Every regret motion has a comparative because you compare between the status quo and the counterfactual. So in these debates, you nearly always want to use comparative analysis. Secondly, and for a similar reason, this house prefers the world motions, in which the counterfactual is the alternative world. Thirdly, and quite obviously, this house prefers X over Y, in which you want to compare between probably X and Y. And aside from particular types of motions that usually beg for comparative analysis, there are particular types of arguments that usually beg for comparative analysis. So first one is weighing. As we've said before, weighing will never be non-comparative. A weighing that is not comparative is not a weighing, it's an impact. Secondly is mutual exclusivity arguments. Every argument that says if we do X, we can't do Y has to have also a comparative burden in it of and Y is better than X because, otherwise I don't care about this being mutually exclusive. Thirdly, substitute for preemptive. I think this is something that many people have asked me before about prime minister speeches and how much time do you want to spend on preemptive. I would posit the following. Most people do preemptive in a very non-cost effective way. Most people do preemptive by saying, opposition is likely to say X, but X is wrong because. There are several problems with that. Firstly, opposition might not say X, and you're wasting a lot of time on it. But secondly, even if they do, if we're using direct refutations rather than competing analysis, if you're going to do preemptive in this manner, you inevitably are going to make competing analysis. Because you do not know yet how opposition is going to analyze X in order to make direct refutation for it preemptively. The better, shorter, and more effective way to do preemptive is to use comparative analysis. So when you analyze your speech, instead of preempting opposition's arguments, just analyze your own constructive arguments to be comparative in the first place. Thus, no matter what opposition is going to argue, you already proved yours to be comparatively better. And they will have to now weigh against it to actually win. Lastly, in extensions, one of my favorite types of extensions could be seen in most of the debates that I was ever filmed for, like Athens, UTC Final, and others. Breaking the deadlock. In every debate, when you have top half says X, like OG said X, OO says Y, no one explains to you which is more likely, which is more important, both can exist at the same time, we are going to break the deadlock, and this is something you can usually do using comparative analysis. We are going to be the first team in the debate to actually be comparative. That is it for the presentation. Now I'm going to leave a time for Q&A, and I believe at this point we probably want to stop the recording because I think